Alicia, thank you for your second thesis. We'll be sure to submit this for your second PhD. Thank you for your time. Literally.
Hey, I'm Alexis or Momo, and I run the famous, just kidding, Instagram account Momo's Bookshelf.
Hello, I'm Alicia.
Hello, I'm Riley, and I run Riley Tries Hobbies on Instagram. I'm over 100 followers since our last podcast, so that's a big accomplishment for me. Yay.
Also, let's talk about how y'all hear her sound right now. A plus.
Crisp.
Look at me with my quality audio. Who would have thunk
Ooh.
I'd get here? Well, with that, let's jump into our fourth episode of Like Literarily. And this episode is about The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. And this book was chosen by our lovely Instagram followers. So thanks, listeners. You guys rock. Just to start with a summary, The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo opens up with us meeting Monique Coleman, a junior journalist at a prominent magazine called Vivant. To her and her boss's surprise, Monique has been hand-selected to interview Evelyn Hugo, a reclusive old Hollywood star who's auctioning off some of her famous gowns to raise money for breast cancer charity in honor of her late daughter. Monique soon learns that she's not just interviewing Evelyn about her charity work, but she is instead getting an exclusive on the star's life for her biography, discussing her successes, her struggles, her backstory, and most infamously, her seven husbands. What initially seems to be a chronicle of typical celebrity life and Hollywood scandal, the story evolves into a narrative that reveals Evelyn's deepest secrets and the lengths that she went through to hide them from the public. The book switches between the present-day point of view of Monique, as well as the point of view of Evelyn during the events of her life. This consistently leaves you wondering, how does Monique fit into Evelyn's story? Ba ba ba. With that, just to open up the episode, I just want to say I absolutely loved this book. I mean, I love kind of like all of Taylor Jenkins Reid books, but I ended up reading this book twice. Once on my Kindle, and then I also enjoyed the audiobook and read that in preparation for this podcast, or listened to it, I guess. Overall, I really enjoyed the dual storylines and the multiple forms of media throughout. Taylor Jenkins Reid does do this in several of her books with the multiple forms of media, and I just really feel like it adds to the story and helps set the scene. What were your thoughts, Alicia?
Yeah, for the book at large, I loved it. It's one of the few books I have bolded in my 2023 reads list, meaning it's top tier. But like Riley was just saying, I really love the setting where Evelyn's being interviewed and telling her life story on her own terms and like in real time, because it just really provides this layer of like emotional connection with her character as you get to know her as she is now, as well as her history and how she kind of came to be where she's at. And so you just really get this, I don't know, yeah, close connection as she's struggling to tell her own story and to just be honest with Monique. And generally, TJR, I've loved all the books I've read by her highly. Just recommend anything you can get your hands on. Evelyn Hugo was the first one I read, and yeah, absolutely loved it. Momo, general thoughts that you had on the book?
Yeah, so I've actually only read two Taylor Jenkins Reid's books so far. First was The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo last year, and then the second one was actually pretty recently. And I actually just recently reviewed it on the Bookstagram, and that was Carrie Soto is Back. So like I said, The Seven Husbands was my first one of hers. I actually read it when I had first started Bookstagram and had just kind of started getting back into reading in general. And really, I think the biggest thing that I loved about it was that ever since starting my Bookstagram into now and like learning about new authors and like up and coming authors and all that kind of stuff, this was another main character of Hispanic background. And growing up, like, I didn't have that. I didn't have characters that were described to look like me or had families like mine. So really, like, that was a huge thing to me, that this was just yet another book that I've been able to read where somebody sounds like me. And then secondly, just honestly, like the plot twist, just the surprise affairs, surprise connections, just all of it overall was really great. So now, as always, we want to announce we're now going to enter that spoiler content segment of the podcast. So for anyone who hasn't read the book, this would be the perfect time to pause it, go read the book, and come back when you finish listening to our episode.
For real though, but with that, so I went into reading this book completely blind. I didn't even read like the summary or anything about the book. I just knew it had a lot of hype and went in and read it not knowing anything about it. And I think that was just so exciting for me going through the spoilers. Like, don't ruin it for yourself. It's just so exciting.
Just go slam that content and come back.
But moving into that, as we know, the book is called The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. So who are these seven? We thought it'd be a good idea just to recap all seven of these husbands. I'm also going to add in the description from the book of how they're described. So the first husband is poor Ernie Diaz, and he is the first husband who Evelyn marries, essentially just to get out to Hollywood. The second, goddamn, Don Adler, who is part of an abusive relationship with Evelyn. She originally really did love him, and the relationship became toxic. They got a nasty, typical Hollywood divorce, and he really tried to trash her name. And then gullible Mick Riva, whom Evelyn ended up marrying, really as a cover-up so people stopped talking about her and her true love, who were having an affair. I'll get to her at the end. And then it was clever Rex North. He was Rex North. He wasn't that exciting. The fifth, brilliant, kind-hearted, tortured Harry Cameron, and really her true friend through her entire life. Next was disappointing Max Gerard. This happened after she broke up with her, former lover for a second time, and she thought they were in love. They were not. He was disappointing, which was a great description of him. Next was agreeable Robert Jameson, who was her final husband, who was again platonic, and it was really just a way to ensure her assets. And then she had one marriage, is what she was quoted saying, and one love of her life, and that was Cecilia St. James, who was an affair that she started, and she knew from doing the movie Little Women, and that was her one true love. And it was very scandalous at the time because it was a homosexual relationship at a time where that was extremely frowned upon. Anything anybody would like to add?
There's a long period where Evelyn is happy with the love of her life, Cecilia, while she's married to Harry, who is dating the person that Cecilia is seeing. Just to make that a little complicated, but there is this like peaceful bliss period, just so it doesn't all sound tortured as we list off the seven husbands of Evelyn Hugo.
And in the end, Robert Jameson is Cecilia's brother, and they do marry and move to Spain, really just to ensure Evelyn's assets and her being responsible in like a legal way to ensuring she gets what Cecilia wants to leave her. So there's nothing complicated with that. Go Robert Jameson. Anyway, moving on. One of the things I really appreciated about Evelyn's character is that she didn't regret anything she did. She made that very clear throughout the story. She didn't feel bad for taking advantage of people to advance in her career or for protecting her family. I think in this way, she was very reminiscent of Scarlett O'Hara and Gone with the Wind. Both characters weren't good people, and they knew they weren't good people, which is just different than what you normally see when you read books. Overall, the reader knew they weren't good, they knew they weren't good, but I still couldn't put down the book, and at times couldn't stop rooting for, like, the main character. Her character was incredibly complicated, as real life is complicated, and it was just fun, and it made it for a really multi-dimensional and interesting character. This might foreshadow who my, like, quote-unquote favorite husband is, for lack of a better term, but it was Mick Riva, or, like, the Mick Riva era, I should better say. But during this era, if like Mastermind by Taylor Swift was about a morally gray character, this was it. Although the miscommunication trope can be extremely frustrating, the lengths Evelyn went through to marry Mick Riva, to hide her relationship with Celia, and everything going on with that, and what she was just willing to sacrifice for her relationship was in some ways honorable. But then the miscommunication with Celia, not being able for Cecilia to accept that she did end up sleeping with McReva, which is like heartbreaking, but also frustrating because it was like, what did you expect was happening here, Cecilia? She married him in a one-night stand. Like, come on. And finally seeing Evelyn get her abortion and only being able to lean on Harry was both tragic and humanizing for her character. So maybe McReva wasn't necessarily my favorite husband, but it was my favorite era. With that, Alicia, what were your thoughts on everything? Do you have a favorite husband?
On the husbands, I guess to me, Harry was clearly Evelyn's like platonic soulmate. He was so supportive, and of course, like they have their daughter together that she's like raising all this money for now in her live interview to support her battle with breast cancer. But Harry's consistency was like a nice warm blanket throughout all the chaos of Evelyn's life, all these different relationships that she was in, whether she was manipulating them or they were manipulating her, or if the media was manipulating her, or if they were manipulating the media. There was just so much complexity going on in all of these relationships that like having Harry there as like this backbone, supportive character was just, it was really nice and yeah, comforting. Also, as Riley was saying, with Evelyn being a mastermind thing, and as I was just like alluding to with the word, I guess, of manipulation throughout, is just like Evelyn's very aware of her image and how her actions will impact it and how she's going to be perceived by who she's seen with and what she's doing outside of her acting roles in her life. And I really just love this exploration in the storyline of how celebrities control their image. And I think this is a really fascinating like space to dive into. Obviously, we're all pretty aware of social media and that it's like not really real, but that's how people portray their life to everybody else that they're interacting with. And obviously, this situation's a little bit different. Evelyn was being spoken for through tabloids and magazines, but just like thinking of the links that influencers and celebrities will go through to maintain their status quo since it is their livelihood is just like mind-boggling to me. So yeah, I thought that was a really interesting aspect of the book, getting to follow along that storyline and see how Evelyn was able to outmaneuver the tabloids throughout the entire story.
Yeah, no, like I completely agree with all of that. Like it's pretty important, especially now, like the message to get out of it is that like what you see is not always the truth. And even like the common phrase that people always say, which is there's three sides to every story, your side, my side, and the truth, you know? Like I think it was just really interesting how that was just so important.
Do you think Evelyn was a reliable narrator?
You know, I feel like essentially with most things, like especially in journalism, right? So I was a communications major and I wasn't a journalism focused communications major, but we had to take journalism classes. And a lot of it is not like a lot of stuff in journalism, I feel like is like, oh, you know, the truth and getting the facts and like blah, 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 whatever. But in all reality, a story is from one perspective. So like unless Cecilia was also there to give her end of things, especially when there was the time period where her and Evelyn didn't really like talk, you don't really know like fully what the whole story is. And then there's a whole other perspective of this. You're talking about the fact that Cecilia married John and Evelyn married Harry. And although Harry was obviously seeing John and Cecilia was dating Evelyn, I mean, those are two other perspectives to the story that you're not even including. So does that mean that she was unreliable? Not necessarily. Does it mean that she was wrong? Not necessarily. But ultimately, Monique was getting, the whole goal was to get Evelyn's story. And this is Evelyn's story.
For me, I was thinking about this a lot too. I feel like at times, Evelyn is like extra hard on herself, which is fair because she's a morally great character. She does questionable things, but I also think she sees Cecilia with rose-colored glasses a lot, especially in the early part of her relationship, because Cecilia did some toxic things as well as Evelyn, and miscommunication was rampant. And I think when they were young, the way she describes it, I think she's just looking for like the best in that relationship, which makes sense. She was the love of her life. And she's obviously going to do that. And I think with that aspect, it's not necessarily like unreliable narration, but I think it's like idealizing the situation. But I agree, like we're never going to know those other parts of the story because in A, it's not real, and B, you know, they're all since past. So it's as reliable as it's going to be.
I think my mind just goes back to kind of how Momo started with there's multiple perspectives to every story and the truth lies somewhere in the middle of it. So I don't think she's probably at this point in her life manipulating this narrative because she's decided to come out with it on her own terms and at her own time. But I mean, there is that little like nagging nugget in the back of my head that's like her whole story is about her manipulating the media and what people think of her. So who knows?
So this kind of actually segues into my like thoughts on it. So like I said, I read it last year, so I kind of had to go back and refresh my brain on what like had all happened during the book. And I'll get into like how I would rate it differently than I did when I first read it. But honestly, just finding out about the fact that Evelyn was bisexual in the first place was like a huge like plot twist that I genuinely was not expecting because the book is called The Seven Husbands. So you're like, whoa, a chick? That's not what I was expecting. So like I was really confused when I first read that, like, whoa, isn't this called The Seven Husbands? And obviously as I kept reading, I ended up finding out more. But to kind of go off of the reliable narrator piece, just like the fact that by the time you get to the end of the book, you end up finding out about why she chose Monique to even be the one to interview her. And it was because of the fact that Monique's father was a lover of Harry's, like as they were older, past like John and stuff. And that was like honestly a huge shock factor to me. And I maybe probably should have seen it coming. I think I at the time maybe knew there had to be some kind of connection. I just didn't know exactly what it was going to be. But really, I think like overall, there was a lot of like, even like with the social media piece and like the image piece and the even like how Riley said, the multi-dimensional pieces of the characters. I really feel like the main thing that I struggled with was Cecilia just facing her own struggles with being lesbian, just kind of coming off with a naiveness behind the realities of coming out, especially at that time. I mean, you're talking decades ago where it's not nearly the same as now. And I know we talked about that a little bit on our episode about Red, White, and Royal Blue, but it's just the reality of it all, right? Like there's all these moving pieces in non-black and white areas of a lot of this. So a lot of how she took that out on Evelyn, being able to essentially like quote unquote fake it in society by being bisexual because she could blend in more, being attracted to men and women, was really kind of like a hard thing for me to read, you know, as like how difficult that was. And I agree with, you know, kind of what Riley said about just like how that had to be really hard. And as somebody who is morally gray, all these lengths that she took to protect that, meanwhile was like being berated in private, I guess, by like the person that she was in love with because of like these constant battles between blending in or not. And then I don't know if I've alluded to the idea and implied it, but my favorite husband was Harry. I did like how throughout from the beginning of their careers to pretty much into old age and death, they always looked out for each other. And that was like a really big element that I liked.
Well, I mean, on that note, if Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo was made into a movie, who do you want to see in that movie?
Oh, I have so many thoughts. Okay, so I think about this a lot. And since we decided that we were going to record this podcast, this is what I've been thinking about. So I have a list.
This is your Roman Empire.
This is my Roman Empire. You are right, Alicia.
Oh my gosh.
Okay, so for me, for young Evelyn, I've like consistently just pictured Selena Gomez, but I can also really see Ana de Armas from Knives Out or Blonde like being like Evelyn. Totally see both of them. And then for older Evelyn, I have trouble picturing anybody other than Rita Moreno from West Side Story being her. Like, she is such an icon, and an icon playing an icon just makes sense in my brain. And also, she's fabulous. Like, how she could do no wrong. Then for Monique, I feel like Nathalie Emmanuel from Game of Thrones would be amazing, or maybe even Kat Graham from Vampire Diaries. I don't know. Both of them seem to vibe for me. Definitely Nathalie, like, more than Kat Graham, but I can see both. And then for Cecilia, I know like the obvious choices are Jessica Chastain from Zero Dark 30, Molly's Game, and like a bazillion other movies that she's fabulous in. Or another obvious choice would be Bryce Dallas Howard from Jurassic World, because they both have like the red hair and the look. But like my wild card and who I like always imagined as Cecilia, I know she doesn't have red hair, but Amanda Seyfried from Mamma Mia to me just has like the iconic girl next door look, and I just feel like she would do fabulous in this role. Anyway, I think about this probably too much. Alexis, what do you think?
I honestly pictured Nora from Red, White, and Royal Blue as Monique Coleman. Honestly, I'm not gonna lie to you. I pictured my good old boy, Nicky G, Nicholas Galzantine as Harry. And then, honestly, I kind of saw, because we know that they have such amazing chemistry, Taylor Perez as a young John. Obviously, I don't remember what John was described as, but in my mind, because I was like, oh, Nick, oh, Taylor. Yeah, that makes sense. And then I honestly also could see like Colton Haynes. He could also probably play like Harry or John. And then just as like a last little like tidbit, I'm a huge West Side Story fan. I've seen the play, I've seen the movies, so Rita Moreno playing older Evelyn would be legitimately perfect. So I know you said that you don't really picture people unless there's already actively a movie or something out. So like, who maybe did you?
I don't even picture it then. I just the people just poof out of my mind. I'm really bad with like facial recognition, even in my real life. So like books, it's just another level of just like disassociated from their faces. They're a little orb that travels around in the storyline half the time for me. But there was one thing on my mind throughout this entire book, and it's my own, well, it's related to my own personal Roman Empire, which is Bleachella, which is Taylor Swift cutting off all of her hair and dyeing it bleach blonde to go to Coachella. And so that is my terrible segue into the Taylor Swift parallels of this book.
Alicia connecting something to Taylor Swift, that's crazy.
Mind blown.
The craziest thing I've ever
never saw this one coming. Evelyn Hugo is not Taylor Swift. I think we're all pretty aware of that. TJR has stated that her inspiration for Evelyn was Elizabeth Taylor. Elizabeth Taylor has also served as a muse for Taylor Swift, though. Not to get too segued too quickly, but Taylor Swift's reputation, Alexis,
yeah,
has allusions to Elizabeth Taylor in song lyrics. She also had an Elizabeth Taylor poster up, I think, in like the Rep Secret sessions where she like sings the album live before it's released to select fans. So we already know that both artists here have drawn from Elizabeth Taylor as inspiration. And so this is going to kind of lead to some of the parallels that we're going to see in the art that they have both made. And this wouldn't be the first time. So this book, The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, came out in about mid-2017. And that was before Taylor Swift's Reputation dropped. Just to make that timeline clear, Reputation came out in November of 2017. But Taylor Swift's Red album came out in 2012. And there we see a whole song plotline that I'll get to in a moment that pretty closely follows this book. So all this to say, I don't know if this book pulls any inspiration from Taylor Swift. I don't know if Taylor Swift ends up pulling any inspiration ever from this book, but we do know that Taylor Swift has pulled from media before to inspire her. And she actually wrote a song, Death by a Thousand Cuts. That song was inspired by Someone Great, which is a 10 out of 10 rom-com on Netflix. And in a full fun aside circularity moment. That rom-com was inspired by Taylor Swift's 1989 album, and specifically the song Clean. So kind of Taylor Swift inspired Taylor Swift indirectly, which I just think is hilarious. Some fun parallels. The book is obviously covering Evelyn Hugo, who is the 60s it girl, as pronounced in like within the first 2 pages of the book. And it says she becomes the 60s it girl within like overnight. It's like instantaneous. And so the most obvious connection to Taylor Swift's discography here is The Lucky One, which was on the album Red. And there's a direct line that says, overnight, you look like a 60s queen. So we're really starting off strong there. We're talking about the same era and kind of like a same plot line. And Evelyn Hugo is a stage name, but The Lucky One has lyrics that also go along this tune, saying, new to town with a made-up name in the angel city chasing fortune and fame. So, fun parallel there. We also see more parallels continue with The Lucky One, and particularly with Evelyn's relationship with Don Adler. We've kind of alluded to Don Adler was emotionally and physically abusive to Evelyn in this story. And The Lucky One pipes, quote, and they tell you that you're lucky, but you're so confused because you don't feel pretty. You just feel used. So we could definitely see that sentiment coming from Evelyn. Kind of moving off the theme of The Lucky One, because clearly that song kind of follows the plot line that we're seeing here. We also have some really clear parallels with Blank Space. So Blank Space is Taylor Swift's like parody song, satire song about how the media portrays her as like a serial dater. The title of this book, The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. We got 2 different pieces of art showing how these women are being undermined for their career, but how they're aware of it and trying to manipulate it as well so they can tell their own stories as they want them to be told. The last one I'm going to highlight is another reference from Lover, which was the 2019 album. And it's not as explicit, but Paper Rings again is one of my all-time favorite songs. Look, Lover just has some really high highs and some really low lows. But Evelyn and Cecilia use a hair tie during a really intimate declaration of love that gave me a bunch of warm, fuzzy feelings and reminded me of Paper Rings. So I wanted to add that to this list of Taylor Swift parallels. So with that, I'm going to stop my Taylor Swift tangent because this is not a podcast on Taylor Swift, unfortunately.
I mean, we could do that too, Alicia. It's really okay. We'll have another podcast.
We just need Taylor Swift to write a book.
Also, in your defense, though, it's like I follow a lot of authors on my Bookstagram, and I noticed that a lot of authors will share some of the music and like playlists that they listen to while writing, and a lot of them have Taylor Swift on it.
Okay.
All right.
Well,
off of the Taylor Swift tangent, Riley, what would you rate this book?
Overall, I really enjoyed this book. I would give it a 4.5. It's like an almost 5, but not quite a 5 for me. I would like to note before we move on that I did both read this book and I also listened to the audiobook. And I think the audiobook was fabulous. I actually think it made the story even better than reading it. The performance and the production of the audiobook. I mean, all of Taylor Jenkins Reid's audiobooks are amazingly produced. And I just think it actually added to the storyline. So if you're looking for an audiobook or you're trying to get into audiobooks, highly recommend this one. Alicia, what are your closing thoughts?
As far as my thoughts, as I said in the beginning, I bolded this book in my list. I loved it. Top tier accolade. Alexis, how about you?
I really just can't wait to read her other books, either by the end of this year or into 2024. And to kind of smoothly transition to concluding this episode, speaking of the end of this year,
our next episode is a Christmas episode. I have no idea why I was the one chosen to introduce that because I am probably the least biggest fan of Christmas out of the 3 of us on this call, and I am purely doing this for Riley and Alexis. But our next episode will discuss the Christmas Carol, and we'll talk about all things related to the holiday season, from favorite books to movies.
But anyway, that wraps up our 4th episode. Make sure to give us 5 stars wherever you are listening. Follow us on Instagram. And be sure to comment and message us on books you would like for us to read in the future and cover on future episodes. Thank you for listening.
Yeah, we're only allowed one tangent per episode, and I clearly used that up on Taylor Swift, but I'll give you the floor next time for your soapbox. Don't worry.